Good morning. Thank you so much for having me this morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. So I'm Brad Badelt. I'm the Assistant Director of Sustainability with the city, and I'm excited to speak this morning about some of the sustainability work that we're doing at the city, particularly the Zero Emissions Building Plan. It's something we're really excited about. We think that this region, this province, can become the leader in North America in zero emissions buildings, and BIM will play a crucial role in that. So this is a great opportunity to speak with you folks. A couple of disclaimers before I get too far into my talk. First of all, when I speak sustainability, I'm of course speaking environmental sustainability. The sustainability group at the city has 20-some staff, and we focus on meeting the city's environmental goals, the climate reduction goals, and our climate adaptation programming. Disclaimer number two, I am not a BIM expert, so I played around with the idea of putting up a slide of my son and I building Lego off of the instructions. I felt like that undersold my knowledge of BIM a little bit, but I am by no means a BIM expert. But hopefully I can share info about the Zero Emissions Plan and connect the dots because there are many connections throughout. So many of you may recall, or perhaps not, the city released its Renewable City strategy in late 2015. This was in the lead up to COP21 in Paris. And that strategy, we were one of a few cities at the time to release similar strategies. There's two targets in it. One is that the city will become 100% reliant on renewable energy by 2050 or sooner. And secondly, that will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. And I remember this moment because I spoke with friends around the time this was released, friends outside of my sustainability bubble. And what I heard was feedback that this was must be totally blue sky thinking, that this must be out there in terms of, I had questions, does Vancouver have enough square footage to hold all these wind turbines and solar panels that would be required to achieve this? So there was clearly misunderstandings about what constitutes renewable energy, but I think people also just saw it as pie in the sky at that moment in time. The world has changed a lot in just two years. So Paris, as we know, the agreement was struck to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. It was ratified in less than a year. Kyoto took many, many years. Virtually every country has signed on to it, and a number of cities have since signed on to 100% renewable commitments. So when you go through this list, I'll say there's kind of the usual suspects in the initial bit there. Victoria, BC, congratulations to Victoria. San Francisco, Aspen, Copenhagen. But you scroll down a little bit further and you see Oxford County, which is just outside of Toronto. Atlanta, Georgia. You don't often see Atlanta in lists with Copenhagen, to be frank. Going down the second column, you're into Pittsburgh, Grand Rapids, Michigan. Their target, I think, is 2035. The one at the bottom, Abita Springs, Louisiana, a small town, 2,500 people in Louisiana, the only town in Louisiana to take on this commitment. They stepped up and took this on because they saw a health benefit for their community to transitioning to renewable. So a huge shift in just 2 years' time. I felt like it's a sustainability talk, so I better put up a photo of the Earth. It's cliche, but I just thought I should do that. So there's a reason for this. This is the blue marble photo, I believe, that was shot by NASA. I wanted to tie the work that we're doing here in Vancouver to the bigger picture because it's really important and there is a direct linkage. So when Vancouver came out with the target to reduce emissions by 80% by 2050, it seemed certainly very ambitious. In order to meet the COP21 requirements, you may be all aware of this, every developing city in the world needs to meet this requirement. It is not out there at all. It is the absolute requirement if we're going to hit that 1.5 degrees. Canada has adopted it. The province of BC has adopted it. It's not out there. It's just a matter of can Vancouver lead on this in order to hit that 1.5 degree change. So the good news is that we can do this in Vancouver. We are uniquely positioned to do this of arguably any city in the world for a few reasons. We're starting off really well. We have one of the lowest greenhouse gas emissions per capita in the world. It's the sort of thing we track in our group where we're down there with the Copenhagens and the Oslos. We're starting from a good place. Our electricity grid is already virtually 100% renewable, which is a huge asset versus East Coast cities that are still dealing with coal and other sources of energy in their electricity. You can see in this graph that it really starts to zero in on where our fossil fuel usage goes. It goes, no surprise, to heating our buildings and to transporting our vehicles. It just starts to frame up where we need to focus our efforts. So 50% of the carbon emissions from Vancouver are from our buildings. So this is where you folks come in. It is by far the largest slice of the pie for greenhouse gas emissions in Vancouver and in most major centers. Moving out of major centers, transportation takes on a bigger piece, but buildings are substantial regardless of where you go. Another real opportunity here is that buildings are an aspect that local governments have a real strong hand in supporting and regulating and influencing, whereas transportation is a much more complicated, the transition to electric vehicles is much more complicated in terms of moving that. So there is a huge opportunity here to cut those carbon emissions and to build buildings that are quieter, healthier, and over the long term, more affordable for people to live in. So the Renewable City strategy that I started off with 2 years ago really set the ambitious target of achieving zero emissions buildings by 2030, which is not that far off. And in fact, there's a bit of an asterisk there. It's 2030 or earlier. Our ambition is to have most buildings hitting zero emissions by 2025 if we can do it. Again, this isn't actually that out there. The province of BC has set a similar target for 2032. The Canadian government has set a similar target for 2035. So we have an opportunity to lead, and we have an economic development opportunity to really become the national leaders on this, but everybody is on this pathway at this point. So this slide, I think, is interesting in that it speaks to why go so fast. 2025 is outrageously fast to get to a standard like that, and I think we recognize that. But when you look at the turnover of buildings in Vancouver, there is an opportunity. So growth has its challenges in terms of preserving heritage, in terms of just change in our city, but it also presents a big opportunity for us. So starting on the left, about 30% of our buildings were, by 2050, 30% of our buildings will have been built before 2010. 2010 was when Greenest City was adopted. It's when we got serious about energy efficiency in our code. Those buildings are going to take a lot of work. Deep retrofits, changing of the heating systems. This is a daunting task. I would call that a wicked problem to fix those buildings. 30% will be built post-2010, but prior to a zero emissions regulation coming into effect. These buildings are performing much better, but are still going to require a significant retrofit. Anytime we talk retrofit, that's a tough challenge to get to zero. But the faster we get to zero emissions, this number here was based on 2030. That's why I have the little blue square underneath it. We're now shooting for 2025. 40% of the buildings by 2050 could be at that standard if we can get there fast enough. It essentially avoids us having to retrofit old buildings if we can do it quicker. So this slide is meant to be hopeful, I think. It's meant to be somewhat optimistic. We're not starting from scratch here. We've already made a lot of gains in terms of the emissions from our buildings with code changes to date. So starting from the left, 33% drop from 2007 to 2014. That's a huge efficiency improvement in buildings. That's primarily in single-family homes, and that was done through code changes. And I'd say we learned a bit through those changes. Those were primarily regulatory changes that didn't have some of the support that we're hoping to roll out through the Center of Excellence and other tools, which I'll speak to shortly. The 2017 rezoning policy, which I'll describe a little bit, brings us down below 12 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared, so we're getting closer already. So we're tracking down already. It's really how do we continue that, and we're undeniably getting into the tougher stuff now. I'd say we've knocked off kind of the easy stuff. We're getting into tougher stuff, but we are on a trend at this point. This slide, I think, is interesting. It surprises people. So people have a sense that Vancouver is primarily high-rise development, and I can see that. When you're disrupted by construction driving through downtown, it's always a high-rise. Even today, single family represents a big chunk of construction in this city, and it doesn't connect to BIM, but it's just worthy of noting that single family is still almost half the construction by square footage in Vancouver. That will change over time. As we densify, that's going to decrease, but it's worth noting that it's there today. 10% is low-rise, 28% is the high-rise tower construction that we're seeing, and then commercial, and I believe that includes institutional, is the last 18%. We've seen innovation in commercial, I think, happening for some time now. I think owners and tenants are demanding it. People recognize the connection between productivity and a good building. People want to market that building to their tenants. So I think commercial has been progressing quite well in terms of its innovation. The taller high-rise stuff has not. There hasn't been that marketing ability with high-performance tall buildings, and so there's a real innovation gap in probably 38% of that circle, the low-rise and high-rise residential. There's a huge opportunity for BIM there. We need to have BIM if we're going to hit the targets, particularly on those built forms. So I'm going to talk about the zero emissions building plan, which gets into a little bit more of the nuts and bolts of what's rolling out now and what's going to be rolling out in the future and how that connects with BIM and drives the need for BIM. So the plan that went to council in 2016 was modeled off of examples we've seen elsewhere. Brussels is one that it was modeled off of, and I'll speak to that towards the end of the slide deck. But it really has 4 components. One is regulation. But it's a little different in 2 ways. One, we've regulated in the past, but we've tended to regulate in isolation. We come out with a new code change and that's it. In this case, we're regulating, but we're also signaling where we're going in 10 years from now so that nobody should be surprised when the regulations continue to roll out. The second piece is we've changed our regulations around energy efficiency quite dramatically. We've shifted from an ASHRAE requirement, which focuses on energy cost efficiency, to focusing on greenhouse gas emissions per square foot, heat loss, and energy intensity. That's a huge shift. We think we're the only city in the world at the moment to be regulating greenhouse gas emissions. Toronto recently picked up on it, and I think they've incorporated that into their zero emissions plan. Heat loss, though, the provincial step code speaks to heat loss and very much aligns with our work, as it does with energy use intensity. So this is the future, I would say, of building performance. But it was quite a shift when this rolled out in our rezoning policy. But directly speaks to BIM because this is all about building envelope and ventilation. The second place is city leadership. The city is committed to build all of its new facilities to a passive house-like standard. This is a pretty, when we rolled out LEED all those years ago, the city likewise committed to, I think, a LEED Gold standard back in 2009. The third one is incentives. We have an expression, it stems from supporting innovation called feed and follow. Feed the leaders and follow behind them to pick up the crumbs. Figure out what they're learning and figure out what barriers they're running into. So we're looking at ways to catalyze and incentivize the folks that want to build this stuff because they're out there right now. How can we keep opening doors for them to keep charging ahead and then sharing their learnings? And the third piece is I guess, the follow part of that feed and follow equation. How can we build capacity? How can we shift from kind of the 5% early adopters to an early majority building zero emissions buildings really fast? And that's something that we have not done in the past. We've let the market sort itself out and figure it out. If we're going to hit 2025 or even 2030, we need to play a much bigger role to get that early majority building them so that we can then regulate. So I'm not going to spend much time on this slide. There's 2 pathways to meet the city's new requirements. There is the envelope pathway, I would call it, the focus on efficiency, building a really good building with a great envelope and a great direct ventilation system that meets our performance outcomes. This is, I would imagine, the majority of the cases going through our rezoning will follow this pathway. The second pathway we describe as a balanced approach, so we're still getting a very good building envelope, but it's combined with a low carbon energy system. So we're allowing technology where it makes sense to do so. In certain built forms, in certain locations, it just makes sense to use technology to meet the outcomes. But both pathways will have the same outcomes, the same goal guiding them. The other piece I would add to this is right now there's 2 pathways. If we're going to hit truly zero emissions, both pathways will be required. So a great envelope combined with a low carbon energy system when we truly hit zero. So this here is one of the strongest connections with BIM. This is the limitations on GHGs, heat loss, and energy use. So the focus here is on building envelope. ASHRAE in the past, it really focused on electrical conservation and mechanical systems. Electrical conservation, so fixtures, lightings, those things have a short lifespan. Mechanical systems can work great. In a residential building with a strata, a complex system can work not great at all. This process here is going to bake in a really good envelope into that building, really good windows. That's the stuff that lasts for 50 years in a building. So we're setting that building up for success. But what it's going to require is energy modeling. It's going to require a good air barrier. It's going to require good construction coordination. It's likely going to require prefab construction. All this stuff links directly with BIM. It's going to be highly unlikely on the high-rise buildings that developers will be able to hit our requirements without using BIM and using it in a more comprehensive way. This is the rezoning policy that went out in 2017. I'm not going to go into the nuts and bolts of it, but I'm going to highlight a few pieces. This went out in May of 2017. It has the limits in place now. Those limits are much more stringent than our code. I believe it's more than 50% more stringent than code. We typically lead with a rezoning requirement, and then we follow with code a few years later. That's our typical process. Rezoning captures about half of the development applications in the city, typically the higher, bigger ones. The second piece is we now require embodied energy to be reported. We're the only city in North America to do this, the first city to do this, and I'll speak more about it, but this is the future, the next step of where we're going with buildings. As energy use comes down, embodied energy becomes much more important, and again, there's a good BIM linkage with that. Enhanced commissioning, so we're borrowing really from the last version of LEED here, but commissioning continues to be an important piece of the rezoning policy. The air tightness, I'll give an example shortly, but air tightness is becoming really, really important. And at the moment, our understanding is it's not necessarily well coordinated through the construction. A lot of people touch the air barrier. Energy system sub-metering and reporting. This is kind of dipping our toe into benchmarking is what this is getting at. So buildings that go through the rezoning process will require sub-metering. They'll be reporting out under energy usage. It's that sort of information that we can feed into our center and share with folks like yourselves in terms of what's working and what's not when these buildings actually get running. There's a number of other requirements. What we've done is essentially borrowed the stuff from LEED that we found was still valuable, but really focused on the stuff that we think is critical for achieving our goals here. Sorry. This is a slide I think is the most exciting in the whole one. The image is perhaps not super exciting, but city and private leadership. So if we're going to hit the 2025 target of zero emissions, we need to start building buildings right now. We can't wait for the rezoning process to go through to construct. Like, we need to get buildings underway. And we're seeing that. So city-led projects, we've got 8 projects in the queue right now on various stages pursuing passive house or a passive house-like standard. We've got a fire hall, big fire hall under construction, a number of other ones. This is fantastic. Our real estate department has really bought into this process. It's the second number, though, that's really exciting. So since the rezoning policy came into effect last May, 6 of 29 applicants, 20%, are voluntarily pursuing the passive house standard. They're saying, we have to hit this energy performance requirement anyway. In the rezoning, let's just go all the way and do passive house. This is huge for us. We've got 3 towers that are in the works at the moment in the kind of inquiry early rezoning process. If those towers land in Vancouver, we will undoubtedly be the lead in North America on passive house construction. So it's exciting to see, again, those early adopters are running with this already. And over 1 million square feet currently in permitting, and we've had some construction as well already on this. So it's just to emphasize, like, this is happening already. This isn't futuristic, it's underway, the change is happening. So a glimpse in the future. This is the building built at Cornell, the tallest passive house building in the world to date. It's 26 stories high. It generated quite a bit of buzz through its construction and completion. A few takeaways from this project. So building envelope, again, is critically important on this. There was a lot of use of prefab. Prefab wall assemblies were critical to this building, and I think they will be for virtually any high-rise that's going to hit passive house. The second thing we heard from the folks at Cornell is that the air barrier was a nightmare. The air barrier testing, the air barrier, even the taping with different surfaces, cold weather, warm weather, all the different trades touching that air barrier, ensuring that it was performing as it should be was a nightmare. And one of the learnings from that is that coordinating the air barrier installation and the inspections throughout the process is critical because I think it cost them a lot of time on this project. A second example, a little closer to home, very close to home, passive house project. They brought in an HRV system inducting from, I believe, from Europe. BIM model wasn't fully connected, and it turned out that the ducting did not fit well within the building itself. It took a lot of cutting of drywall and a lot of jigging to get the ducting into space. It's that sort of thing where BIM could avoid that. BIM could coordinate that and avoid a lot of headaches. And so I think the early adopters are seeing that, and I'm sharing it right now, and I think through what we want to create with the center, it's an opportunity to share these lessons that people are learning already. So this is maybe the slide I'm most interested in, I'm probably most knowledgeable on. So this capacity building is, we think, the secret sauce in what we're putting forward with the zero emissions plan. As I said earlier, we as a city, and I think most cities, we've tended to regulate. We change the bylaw, we consult on the bylaw, and that's it. This is different. This is how can we support the industry to learn quickly. We've heard from early adapters that they want to share the information, even lessons learned. They don't want to see others make the same mistakes, like that Cornell air barrier example. They're sharing that information, but we need a forum, a space for that to take place. And that's really what we have in mind with this capacity building piece. So I'm really excited about it because we have entered into, or in the process of entering into a contract with the Vancouver Regional Construction Association. We're very excited to have that partnership. It's such a great connection with the industry. Passive House Canada is playing a role in this. We have a job description up at the moment. We're aiming to have the center open in May. We think it's going to fundamentally change and accelerate how we do buildings here. And the real emphasis is on not me talking to folks in that space, it's on connecting builder to builder, designer to designer, modeler to modeler. The second piece I would emphasize is right now I hear from the odd builder, I hear from the odd designer with barriers, with complaints, to put it frankly. We have no formal process for prioritizing or vetting those barriers. This center should do that. I'll give one example. We've heard from frustrated architects that they do their energy modeling, they come up with a building design, they show up at our urban design panel, and we want the building more articulated. We want more window openings. And suddenly, that building envelope is changing dramatically. That's the sort of barrier that we need to fix, and that's the sort of barrier that this space is meant to err and then seek out solutions for. Connect with academia, connect with suppliers. We've got gaps in supply chain. So we think this is a critical cog in the whole process, and we're super excited to have it finally launched. I mentioned the zero emissions, kind of the frontier being embodied carbon. So we're the first city to require reporting. We're not regulating it, just the reporting of it. Reporting typically is the start of a future regulation. And the reason we're going there is as emissions, operating emissions go down, the embodied carbon in that building becomes more and more important. So look to it as the future. Again, I know there's linkages with BIM. I know Autodesk has linkages here for doing embodied carbon. It is the future. Timber construction is likely a big part of that construction. There's huge local economic gains from that. There's embodied carbon gains from that. I'm sure many of us have been to Brock Commons. It's coming for sure, and that simple reporting requirement is that tip of the iceberg of that coming. A couple slides to maybe leave on a really positive note. This one is to say that this has all been done somewhere else, and we see this a lot in sustainability. It's both hopeful and frustrating. I'll use the electric bus example. It's my personal frustration. There's a city in China, Shenzhen, that has 17,000 electric buses. Their whole fleet is electric buses. We don't need innovation here. We just need to do what they're doing over there here. In this case, there's a bit of a roadmap as well for buildings. So many of you may have heard the example of Brussels. Brussels in the early 2000s had one of the worst, if not the worst, building code in all of Europe in terms of energy efficiency. Brussels embarked on a program signaling early that they wanted to get to a passive house-like standard, which I imagine at the start must have seemed astonishing for this particular place. But they rolled out a program that I think has some really important ingredients. One, they had a big pot of money, which we can't replicate, but they did have a big pot of money that incentivized near zero emissions developments, but they did it in a really interesting way. They rolled it out through a competition. And the competition wasn't all about energy performance. It was about performance. It was about cost effectiveness, replicability, and aesthetic quality. The buildings had to look good. So they handed out a lot of money through this competition over a number of years, hundreds of buildings. It built a lot of prestige for these buildings, and it changed the perception from these are ugly buildings to these are really high prestige, beautiful looking buildings that can do a lot of different things. They also made sure that when they gave out the money, there was strings attached to it. So the developer didn't just go off and build a building and that was the end of the story. The developer had to host tours, technical tours, public tours. The developer had to share information through publications. The developer had to have ribbon cuttings where people could come out and celebrate them. There was a whole bunch of strings to ensure that the learnings of those developers and builders and designers was shared with the market. And there was a little bit of competition built into it as well in terms of one-upmanship from building to building. So those ingredients of signaling regulation early, incentivizing, and carrying the learnings to the rest of the community seems like it's the key ingredients to really leverage quick change. And they were actually successful in getting to a pass-fail standard in about 8 years, which is really remarkable. And if we could do that ourselves, it would be fantastic. And we're arguably better positioned than they were in the early 2000s to do it. Sorry, I keep doing that. The last one is to say, it's a quote, if you can guess who it is. Well, I don't know if I'll buy you lunch, but good on you if you can guess who it is. We overestimate what we can achieve in 1 year, but we underestimate what can be done in 10. I would say in sustainability, we're certainly guilty of this, but it's remarkable when people or groups or in this case, a region stay on a path, how much dramatic change can happen in 10 years. The quote's from Bill Gates, who has definitely generated some dramatic change himself. I mean, Falls Creek is a classic example. 80s to 2000s, the change is unbelievable to the point where we're now considering swimming in Falls Creek. I'm not, but many people are. It's remarkable. And I think if we look ahead at 2028 and think where this region could be, where this industry could be, it could be dramatically different than it is today. And we need to start thinking that way now rather than focusing on sort of the short term with this. So thank you very much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. It was very informative. I'm glad we could hear from this city on the sustainability initiative. I know it's been a key target for the City of Vancouver for quite some time now. And I think what we're seeing is Vancouver really leading the sustainability initiative, which is really nice to see. Do we have any questions from the audience?
You mentioned energy performance modeling. In Ontario, the Ontario Power Authority actually subsidizes energy performance modeling for new buildings. I think there's nothing in place yet for existing buildings. And I'm just wondering if the city is considering incentives or something, or mandating reporting requirements, for example, that would actually require energy performance modeling.
That's a great question, and it has come up through our consultation that early energy modeling, there's a cost barrier. Developers in some cases are reluctant to spend that money early on, and it's early that it's so important. I think we're really interested in doing that. A challenge we've had with incentivizing is we as a city have a really difficult time putting money into the private sector's hands. And that's been a struggle with rolling out a lot of our Catalyst tools, but I would say that one is definitely near the top of our list, and we're trying to find ways of making that happen to at least get the early energy modeling in place so that developers have the options in front of them to make a good choice. So it's certainly something. Thank you for raising it.
Brad, that was a great presentation. Thank you. Just one quick question. It's maybe too detailed for today. Those 6 of the 29 applications that are currently in the pipeline, do you know if they're residential or non-residential, meaning residential or commercial, just out of interest?
I believe they're all residential, Fiona.
Okay.
At the moment, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Just wanted to clarify that.
I would add the city's facilities, of course, are primarily non-residential, so there's a whole bunch of institutional examples coming down the pipeline. And I should also add BC Housing and other public entities are following a similar path. So it's not just the city, it's other cities around the Lower Mainland and Southwest BC, probably across BC, BC Housing and others.
All right. Thank you, Brad.
Great.
Sorry. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was excellent.
Awesome.
If there's some digital infrastructure plan to have all of that, the data that you require, come into a central place so it can be part of the digital city model?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So the Center of Excellence will absolutely have a very prominent digital aspect to it. We have one of the partners is the Open Green Building Society, who specialize in sharing information digitally. So we will certainly have best practices and a number of different resources available there so that people can access them. The intent is that these would be vetted resources, so it's not just a grab bag of stuff. It's stuff that we as a group feel is legitimate and reliable. And the other piece, of course, that I should mention is that BIM is an obvious thing to bring to that center, to share the learnings around BIM and to influence our peers to get more people involved with that. So it should be a really good fit.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm very excited personally to learn more about the Center of Excellence. I think it's a great initiative and a great opportunity to really bring the industry together at all levels.
Definitely.
So that's
Great.
good. Great.
Thank you.
Brad.